Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
Sorry, Tim, I gotta go, so I really can't get into this intro too in depth, and I'll just cut right to the chase and ask you how you're doing today.
Wow, so many puns just coming at us
in less
today.
than 7 seconds.
I'm doing great. Yeah, we had a really cool conversation with an author named Dan Zimmerman. He's a local guy to Massachusetts, and he wrote a book called Chasson's Run, the prison break that captivated America and the love story that fueled it. And this is about Leroy Chasson, who was a criminal who escaped prison with the help of his wife.
That's right. His wife, Kathleen, was instrumental in his escape. The method in which he removed himself from the prison to a hospital, I don't want to give anything away, but very bold way to get yourself out of prison so that you would be in need of medical attention. But what's even more riveting about this is how everything went down at this hospital before they escaped. His wife coming in dressed as a nurse, she has a gun. They decide to not put the stomach chain, the belly chain on him so that he wasn't fully restrained. So that was one of the lucky breaks that they had. One of the guards that was escorting them ends up being in the bathroom at the time. So all of the pieces fell into place for this prison break, and it became more of a love story, as we talk about here, how the two of them would basically do whatever it took, even to the death, to protect each other. So you have a little bit of a love story here.
Yeah, it's a really cool story, and this is Daniel's second book. His first one is called Shots in the Dark, that is supposed to be great as well, about local crime here in Boston. So yeah, definitely check out Daniel's books. I think you'll really like them. We had a great conversation with him.
And Tim, you know, and I know, and I think a lot of the listeners out there know, but I'm just going to be redundant about this. On Wednesday, June 11th at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we are going to have a fundraiser for the nonprofit that we are on the board of, Private Investigations for the Missing. Please check out what they do at investigationsforthemissing.org. It's been a little time since we've hosted a virtual fundraiser, and that's going to be on the Missing podcast. So we have the other show that we do, Missing, on YouTube. So at Missing CSM, that's the channel on YouTube. Wednesday, June 11th, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope to see you all there. All of you.
Every single one.
All 14 million of you.
All right, everyone. So please follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. We're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with Dan Zimmerman.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome to the podcast, Dan Zimmerman. Daniel, how are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for asking. How are you?
We're doing great. My anxiety and my adrenaline is still pumping after going through the book that we're going to talk about today, something that you put together based on a true crime incident that happened in Massachusetts a long time ago. But yet you pulled together all the details in such a way, so good. But before we get into that, I just want to announce that you're my neighbor, basically.
Yes, we are.
Randomly.
Natural rivals.
Yes, we have West Side Story type knife fights in the parking lots of Walmarts around here.
More or less.
Yeah, more or less.
It's a good thing, like I said earlier, that we're not rivals in sports because our two towns are in different leagues.
Well, your town is just in a league of its own.
There you go. Thank you.
For anyone out there who does not know who you are, can you fill the audience in on yourself, your background?
Sure. Okay, so I'm as of now I'm semi-retired. Although as a semi-retiree, I work 4 part-time jobs. So I'm putting in just about as many hours as I did when I was a full-time worker. But I had 2 distinct 20-year careers. I started out in my early 20s as an EMT, emergency medical technician, with a private ambulance service in the town of Norwood, Massachusetts. And I did that for about 20 years. And as I did my 40th year, I decided to switch careers entirely, and I joined a local gas utility, a big gas utility here in Massachusetts, National Grid, as a field supervisor. So those are my 2 distinct careers. And then when I semi-retired a couple of years ago, I picked up several part-time gigs that I really enjoy. And that was always my dream when I reached retirement, that I would be able to work jobs that I enjoyed. One of them involves writing. I write for a local newspaper here. I cover the high school sports. As a matter of fact, when I finish this interview with you folks, I have to run over to the ball field and cover a baseball game. So that's one of my side gigs. I've been doing that for about 25 years. I'm also a track and field official at local high schools with the state, and I work at 2 area colleges as a campus police dispatcher. I split my time between them. And when I'm not doing those, I'm writing books like Chasson's Run.
You only retired so that you could work
Exactly.
more.
But I spread myself around a little bit. I never get too stale in a chair. I'm always moving on to the next job. It's enjoyable.
I bet it is. When you're working with, I didn't even expect to ask this question, but when you're working covering the high school sports, do people who you're speaking with or the editors of that paper, do they know about your life writing books about true crime?
Yeah, actually, it's funny you say that because the local paper here in my town, I submit a story a week. I cover the major sports. I live in North Reading, and I cover the major sports at the high school: football, hockey, and now baseball. And so my editor just sent me a photo of himself holding my book. He had bought it on Amazon, and he had a copy, and he wanted to show me that he purchased one.
That's
yeah,
awesome.
people are aware of where I am and what I'm doing. They all shake their heads. They say, most retirees go golfing, and me, I just pick up more jobs. But I like to be on the move. I like to keep in motion.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
And so you've just released your second book.
Correct.
Before we get into your new book, can you tell us a little bit about your first book?
Sure. That book was called Shots in the Dark. It's been out for closing in on 7 years now since it was first released by Wild Blue Press. And that tells the story of a Boston North End mob figure by the name of Rocco Bolero. Petty criminal. He did small crimes along with his family and the family that his family worked for. And that would be the Angulo family. And a lot of people in the Boston area are very familiar with the Angulos. Boleros were an offshoot of the Angulos. And Rocco was one of 6 male sons, and the entire family was involved in some criminal aspect. Rocco, unfortunately, in 1962, got caught up in a double murder. In that, a shooting that took place in Roxbury, a 21-year-old woman and her 2-year-old son perished. And that would be my aunt and my cousin. So I had very close ties to the story. I was only 2 years old when it took place. I was just a toddler, but I was the same age as my cousin who was killed. I grew up over the years with the story, and I decided that I was gonna write the story. And I reached out to Mr. Bolero at the time. He was incarcerated at MCI Norfolk Prison, and asked if I could visit with him and discuss it. He agreed, and I spent the next 2 years interviewing him twice a week. Every Tuesday night, every Saturday morning, I'd make my trip to the prison, process myself in, and sit with Mr. Bolero for a couple of hours. Shots in the Dark was the result of that, along with a lot of other interviews, police, attorneys. I even had dinner with the head of La Cosa Nostra, the head of the mob at the time. And when I stopped shaking, I had a lot of questions for him, but he was accommodating. He definitely answered my questions. Rocco was wrongly accused of these killings. I first approached the book. I was going to write the story of Rocco Bolero, cold-blooded murderer who killed my relatives. But it didn't take me long to discover that that wasn't the case. And the book took a different direction, and I spent literally 450 pages telling his story. He was a very exciting individual. He escaped from 3 different prisons. If Wild Blue Press had allowed me to, I would have written 1,000 pages on that story. He had so much to share, and so did a lot of his friends and associates, along with officials that were involved in the case. I met some really great people that most would not sit down to dinner with, but I guess you could say I was on their side. I was telling the true story of one of theirs, and they appreciated that throughout, including the family. Rocco's family was 100% on board, and as a matter of fact, when he passed away, they asked me to present the eulogy, which I agreed to do. And it was really interesting.
What? What?
Yes. St. Anthony's Church in Revere. I stood at the podium and I looked out at the audience, and it was ex-cons, actual criminals, mafia figures, police, a lot of police showing their support to the family. And I did the eulogy, and it was an amazing experience.
Is that one of those moments where you're standing there and you're like, how did I get
Not
here?
so much at the eulogy because I was fairly deep into it. The dinner I had with Peter Lamone, who I mentioned as he was a 2-year head of the mafia, Boston Mafia. He had been in prison for 33 years for a murder he did not commit. And he was obviously out at this point. And Rocco's older brother, Billy, arranged the dinner. And I got to sit down and ask him a lot of questions because he was incarcerated with Rocco. But that was one of those times where I did say that, where I'm saying, wait a minute, I'm Dan Zimmerman. I'm from a little town in southeastern Massachusetts. What the heck am I doing here? I'm sitting here at a table with the head of the mob. He could snap his fingers and I'd be gone. It was just it was a great experience.
What did you both have for dinner?
Had to have pasta. He actually had something very interesting to say. And, it's one of those, actually two things that I will never forget. The first was he asked me when the book came out if I was going to do signings. And I said, of course, Mr. Lamone, it has to be done. I want to do that. And he says, all right, well, here's the deal. He says, I want to be first in line for your signing. He says, not your wife, not your children, not your coworkers or colleagues, me. He says, but I just won $25 million from your federal government. And he says, I'm going to buy a bunch of copies. He and three other folks, three other gang members, sued the federal government for wrongful arresting and incarceration. The 33 years that they spent in prison, they weren't the killers. And that came out in the early 2000s. And they went ahead and sued the government and won $100 million, 25 each. Two of the men had died in prison, and Mr. Lamone and one other survived to collect that money. Needless to say, their families are doing okay today. 25 million each. That was because of our FBI. The FBI orchestrated a frame up of these four gentlemen to protect a witness that they needed.
What a backfire.
Yes, it really did backfire. It backfired 100 million times.
Wow. So did he buy
a book? He passed away before it was released, but I believe his family members did buy one.
Let's talk about your new book, Chasson's Run, the prison break that captivated America and the love story that fueled it. First question is, how did this story come to you? How did you come to tell this one?
Well, oddly enough, as I explained with Shots in the Dark, I had a very distinct connection to the story with two relatives that perished. With this one, I worked for the ambulance company that transported inmates from MCI Walpole Prison and MCI Norfolk Prison. That was my full-time job as an EMT. So I was very familiar with the prisons, very familiar with quite a few of the inmates, obviously the corrections officers. Over the years, I built up quite a rapport with both, actually. That was my connection. So Labor Day weekend, 1982, comes rolling around. I was scheduled to work. I had a girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife. So I reached out to one of my coworkers, the owner's son, Bobby Zamito. And I said, Bobby, look, I'd like to take my girlfriend away for the weekend. Any chance we could swap? You could work for me. And he kind of hedged a little bit, but then he agreed, sure, I'll work for you. So I come back to work on Tuesday morning, walk in the office, ready to go, ready to do some calls. And Bobby comes over to me and puts his two hands on my neck and starts to choke me. And I said, Bobby, it was joking, of course, but I said, Bobby, what's the matter? What's the problem? He says, because I worked for you, because of you, I had a gun held on me. I could be dead right now. Turns out that Bobby and one other of my coworkers were the two EMTs that transported Mr. Chasson to the hospital, where certain events took place that led to his escape.
You were a date away from being one of those people.
Had I been home and not gone away, it would have been me in that ambulance and in that hospital emergency room when all this went down. Again, I had plenty of exposure to prison inmates that, you wouldn't have to dinner. Over the years, I've met every type and sort of criminal that you could meet. It was kind of funny when I was interviewing Rocco for the first book. One of the questions he asked me during our interviews was, are you afraid coming in here to the prison? A lot of people fear entering prisons. And I said, Rocco, I may not have spent as much time as you here, obviously, but I've spent a lot of time in here picking up your colleagues, taking them to the hospital for illnesses and injuries. So no, I'm not afraid of going in and out of prisons. I'm very used to it, very comfortable doing it.
Can we find out what Leroy did to become incarcerated?
Well, if you look at his record, it started at the ripe old age of 8 years old, 9 years old, breaking and entering. He wasn't very good at it. He used to get caught all the time, arrested. But in his early years, he would spend, obviously, they weren't going to imprison a youth of that age right up into his teen years. He would end up in reform schools. And here in Massachusetts, we had 7 of them. They weren't the nicest places. In fact, they were violent to these children to the point that some of the police officers tasked with capturing them when they escaped and bringing them back didn't want to bring them back. There was a story in the Boston Globe where a couple officers were interviewed. They didn't give their names, obviously, but they said it was just so terrible to bring these kids back to these places because they could hear the screaming from inside, and they knew what was going on, the beatings, the assaults, just the terrible abuse. Lee Chasson would often be brought to those places for his assorted crimes as a youth and escape. And that's where he learned how to get out of places. He was very good at it, but he wasn't good at staying out. They'd always find him and bring him back. Those reform schools scattered around Massachusetts were eventually shut down by the government. They hired a gentleman that would undo the system, and he did. By the late 70s, most of them were closed and being utilized for other means. They do have places for youth to go when they commit crimes, but the reform schools are long gone. But he graduated from petty crime, which included stealing, breaking and entering, setting fires. He liked to set fires. He burned down a garage. He burned down a car. Book of matches in his hand was a dangerous thing. He graduated to a real crime when he shot a gun out a window of his apartment in Somerville and hit a girl in the face. She obviously survived, but she had lifelong scarring. And they arrested him for firing a weapon like that. And he did some time for that. He eventually got paroled. The system worked in his favor. But not long after he was paroled, he committed his first armed robbery of a pharmacy in Cambridge. During the commission of that crime, he actually took a police officer hostage. The Cambridge police talked him out of it, and he released the officer, and off to jail he went for a 7 to 15 stretch at MCI Walpole, one of the worst places around.
Can you describe Walpole? It's not open anymore.
No, it isn't. They're closed. It's closed now. In fact, on the cover of the book, you probably see on the right side, next to his mugshot, you see a picture of one of the towers. That's at Walpole. I had that from a previous visit. It was very difficult to escape. In fact, other than Leroy and one other gentleman who escaped back in the 70s, nobody got out of Walpole unless it was with permission. They had the toughest of the tough as far as inmates. For instance, one of the blocks at Walpole was called 10 Block. And it was a place that you did not want to go when you were an inmate. These were guys that not only killed people on the outside, but they killed each other. In fact, it was such high security at 10 Block that they could not mix with other inmates during their recreational time. They had cages that connected directly to their cells where a door would open. They would come out into the fresh air, but they'd be caged in. And then after their hours time outside, they'd be put back in their cell. So they never associated, had any contact with other inmates or much anybody. I got to witness that a few times because the infirmary at Walpole was in the back end of the prison. So when you entered with the ambulance, you actually drove in. You had to go through a series of gates and then pass those cages at 10 Block. And sometimes you would sit and wait in the ambulance as the corrections officers would undo the gates for you to pass through and go to the next phase. And those inmates weren't very pleasant people to us, to the EMTs. Give us gestures. They would yell things at us. They'd have pretend shotguns where they'd shoot at us, and just really bad people. Lee Chasson spent some time in 10 Block during his assorted incarcerations over the years. So he was in the max.
So what type of criminal goes into Walpole, especially into 10 Block? Like, how do they determine when the person is at their trial? How do they determine that that's where they're going to go?
Generally, it's murder, rape. I've met many murderers and rapists over the years. Oddly enough, people don't know this on the outside, but in the confined space back of the ambulance, these guys, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them like to tell you about their crimes. It's their badge of honor, I guess you could say, the crime they committed to reach MCI Walpole. And you would tell them, I really don't want to hear this story, but they'd insist. Murder, rape, armed robbery, violent crimes, and generally that would be a first offense, but you will also have inmates who have climbed the ladder, starting with petty crimes on up to assault and battery, where the system finds that they can't be reclaimed, and they end up in Walpole Prison. And then there's Norfolk Prison, which is 2 miles to the northwest, and similar facility. It was built on the same plans a few years later, and it's more of a minimum security, so it's a step down. A lot of inmates in MCI Norfolk have either done 15, 20 years of their life sentence and they're being stepped down to a lesser degree security, or they've done lesser crimes and they end up there. And that's where I did most of my visiting with Mr. Bolero in the first book, was MCI Norfolk. Just to give you a quick 5-cent tour of how he ended up there, because I didn't answer that question. He was incarcerated at MCI Concord, so literally steps from where the American Revolution got its start. They built a prison, a substantial prison actually. Along with MCI Walpole, MCI Concord is slated to be closed. If you read the articles and you hear the stories, a lot of the crime rate is way down in Massachusetts. And they're also finding alternative ways to handle these folks instead of putting them behind bars. So he was incarcerated there for drug charges, along with a friend of his by the name of Mark Bray, who plays a huge role in this book. Mark was owed money for a drug deal gone bad. They got drugs smuggled into the prison, but he didn't get the amount he expected, and he was owed money. And then he escaped. He went on the run. At the time, Chasson was out on parole. He had made it out on his own, and they met up. And basically, Mr. Bray asked Chasson if he would retrieve the money owed from a gentleman in Quincy. So Chasson got a ride to Quincy, went into a park where the kids, 20-somethings, would hang out and have a couple of beers and just chat. And he got in a fist fight with the guy that owned the money. He went after him. Basically, you owe my friend money. We want it, or we want drugs. The fight between Chasson and this other individual triggered a melee in the park. All the friends of the individual who got punched by Chasson ran to his aid, and they all kind of jumped on the back of Lee Chasson, and he produced a knife and stabbed 2 of them, one fatally. A 20-year-old youth by the name of Paul Melody, he perished. The other gentleman who was stabbed suffered kidney injuries in his back, and he recovered. So off to jail, eventually court, and then eventually prison. Of course, in between, there was a week he was on the run. And then once again, Leroy Chasson on the run. He managed to elude the Boston police for a while. About a week, he and Mr. Bray and Leroy's wife, by the name of Kathleen Chasson, were on the run. They made the mistake of stopping in Maine and trying to rob a antique store. The local police up there got wind, set up a sting, and crashed the party, so to speak. They arrested Kathleen. They arrested Mr. Bray. Leroy Chasson escaped for about 4 hours until the Maine and New Hampshire State Police and a plane overhead found him and captured him. Soon after that, he was off to prison.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Can you give us some details on Leroy's drug usage? How much did that factor into the crimes that he committed?
Actually, quite a bit. He was a heroin addict. He did a lot of petty theft, robbing small stores, gas stations, whatever it may be, to fuel that habit to buy his heroin. Not quite as bad. He seemed to rebound from the heroin use when he got out of prison. Prison tends to make heroin users use more heroin because it's so easy to get their hands on. They have it brought in, either smuggled in by friends, family, or, I hate to say it, but sometimes a corrections officer for a little extra side money will help their cause and bring in some of this contraband. He fed that habit all through his life, from his teens all the way up into adulthood, by stealing other people's belongings, and whether it was cash or whether he fenced stolen property. He found the means.
One part that I found really curious and interesting was he looked at the sentencing of Berkowitz, the son of Sam. You write in there that he thinks,
how could somebody stay?
Yeah, 50 years.
Well, oddly enough, my first book, Rocco Bolero, was in prison for 50 years. So, I mean, I actually knew somebody who had that mentality where I've been here for 50 years. You hear about it on the news where these inmates get early parole. They find their way out of prison, even with a life sentence. But I've known of people who failed in that attempt. I know another gentleman by the name of Patrick O'Shea who murdered a police officer during a bank robbery. We became not friends, but we grew to know each other as I was transporting to and from the prison. He is now 84. He's been in prison for 44 years on a life sentence. So sometimes they don't get out. They live in these places for 4 or 5 decades or more. They seem to get involved in a lot of different things that the prison does offer them. Rocco, in the first book, became a preacher. The gentleman I just mentioned, Mr. O'Shea, teaches kids on how not to become criminals. Kind of his version of Scared Straight. They find things to enhance themselves. They take classes. They learn new trades, all that stuff. And a prison is a city within itself, so they become part of that community and get involved in a lot of different things. So I guess for them, 50 years is a long time, but not as long as you and I would think.
Do you think that him hearing that sentencing of Berkowitz inspired him to perform his escape?
I think what inspired him was that he had a wife on the outside who had the knowledge and the means to make it happen. That probably helped him a little bit. Without her, he'd probably still be in prison today. She orchestrated the entire escape. She visited him on a regular basis, and obviously they talked it out. They figured it out. She even moved to Walpole. Took an apartment in Walpole so she would be close to the prison to make it convenient to go back and forth. I think obviously she was pivotal in the whole escape, and without her, it wasn't happening.
It's a pretty badass escape.
Yes, it is. As I was writing the book, I thought, this is actually kind of simple. What they did was a simple escape. There's some pretty elaborate escape tries out of these prisons that I'm aware of. This one was simple. I mean, he orchestrated a very simple escape and made it work. I use this term in the book. He left the corrections officers red-faced. They were embarrassed. And the hospital, Norwood Hospital, was extremely angry about it because their patients and their staff, they were put at risk because there was gunplay involved. There was a shootout that took place. There was some angry people and there was some embarrassed people over a relatively simple escape, in my opinion.
Can you tell us how the escape happened?
So Leroy's at MCI Walpole Prison. It's breakfast on the morning of Labor Day. He's gotten hold of a ballpoint pen, which they're not supposed to have, but there is a little bit of leeway in certain things. And so that morning he decided to stab himself with a ballpoint pen. He took the pen and stabbed himself 3 times in the abdomen. When you stab yourself with a ballpoint pen, it has to hurt like heck. And then he did it 2 more times. So he would get adequate bleeding from the wound. Then he came out in the hallway in the corridor, started basically yelling for help. One of the corrections officers saw him, ran to his aid, and he and another officer basically dragged a bleeding Leroy to the infirmary in the prison. The doctor treated the wounds, looked over the wounds, and felt that there may be internal injuries of some sort. He doesn't know to what depth. Obviously, Leroy was telling his keepers that he was stabbed by another inmate, not stabbed himself, because he would have gave up the ghost at that point. He said, "Yeah, I was stabbed. They call for an ambulance. They take him down to the Norwood Hospital. There are 3 corrections officers. Generally, they send 2. Because of Leroy's propensity for escaping from places, they decided to have an extra hand. When the prisoner gets transported from the prison to a hospital, a requirement protocol is that he has a belly chain on, leg irons to keep the feet together, and a belly chain which wraps around the back to the front. And that's where they handcuffed him. They put the handcuffs attached to the belly chain. Pretty trussed up at that point. They're not going anywhere. The doctor decided not to have belly chains put on Mr. Chasson and instructed the corrections officers not to attach the belly chain because he felt that the belly chain rubbing up and down on the wounds would trigger more bleeding. He left the prison without belly chains or handcuffs, just the leg irons. And it is believed, it's not proven, but it is believed that Kathleen, his wife, knew that was going to happen. She sensed that he would have no belly chains and potentially have his hands free. That was very important in the escape. So they get to Norwood Hospital. He's in the trauma room. They call it the code room at Norwood. And they're treating him. There's nurses, doctors, in the room with him, the two EMTs, Paul and Bobby, that had transported him, one corrections officer. The other two corrections officers, one of them, the one armed, they only let one guy have a gun, not all three. He was down the end of a corridor calling the prison to let them know they had arrived safely. So he was out of the picture. The third corrections officer was in the men's room. According to him, and he's the one I interviewed for the story, he had to use the bathroom very badly. And so he told his partner, I'll be right back. Well, while he's in the men's room, into the trauma room walks another nurse. And nobody recognizes her, but there's so much commotion, so much going on that she wasn't, nobody asked her anything. And even one of my witnesses, one of the EMTs said, I thought I knew all the nurses, but I didn't know her. You just kind of put it aside because it's a holiday. And sometimes they hire agency nurses for the day, fill up their staff. So they kind of almost ignored her. Now, she was holding a towel over her arm, kind of like a waiter would do in a fine dining restaurant. Next thing you know, she pulls the towel off and she shows him a .45 automatic. This is Leroy's wife, Kathleen. She hands him, holds everybody at bay. He pulls out his IVs. He pulls off the oxygen mask. He pulls off everything, just rips everything out of his body. Jumps off the stretcher with the leg irons on, mind you. Takes the gun from her, holds them all at bay. And his parting words were, sorry, folks, but I got to go. Off he leaves. He and Kathleen running out of the emergency room. Now, he's shuffling because he doesn't have much of a range in his steps because of the leg irons. But it's enough to make his way out to the parking lot with Kathleen in the lead. She's running for the getaway car to get it started, get his door open. In the meanwhile, one of the correction officer came out of the restroom, was told what was happening. He yells for his colleague who's got the gun, we need the gun. He comes running, runs out in the parking lot, and he and Chasson exchange gunfire, shooting at each other. Nobody gets hit. Chasson gets in the car with the wife. They scream out of the parking lot, and they're gone. An accomplice who was never named all through the years had set up a second car, left in it some money, clothing, change of clothing, and a pair of bolt cutters, enough to cut off the leg irons. And meanwhile, the Norwood police have responded. They've got cruises all over the place. Can't find them. They're gone. They eventually find the first car. Chasson and his wife are now long gone. And that starts what I call an odyssey, 7 years, cross country, eventually after stops in New Hampshire, Chicago, Seattle, Kansas City, Nevada. Eventually they land in Denver. 1988, years later. Now, in the meantime, everybody's looking for him, but nobody's having any success. They've changed their name. They've got new credentials. They're in Denver, and a TV show makes its first appearance in 1988. A lot of people would know the name, America's Most Wanted. And they decided to feature Leroy Chasson. The first broadcast didn't lead to anything. The second broadcast did lead to something. The FBI got some good leads, and they found Leroy. When America's Most Wanted was preparing this show, they came to Norwood, Massachusetts, and visited the office of the ambulance service, and they wanted to hire an ambulance and 2 EMTs. So I happened to be working that day, and the office manager looks at me and he says, hey, Dan, so you missed the first one. You want to do the second one? You want to do the reenactment? And I said no, because I didn't want to be associated with anybody the likes of Leroy Chasson. Why would I associate myself with him? He's a criminal. He's a murderer. And he says, all right, suit yourself. So they got 2 other EMTs. They did the gig. And lo and behold, weeks later, they come into the office holding substantial royalty check. I was left out in the cold a second time. So.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Well, newly married with a 3-year-old, I could have used the money, but I chose not to.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
You mentioned this accomplice and how they had everything sort of in its place when they managed to escape from the hospital. They got into the vehicle. Everything was left for them. And you said the accomplice has never been named. And going through your work here, does double checking it, like that person's never been named,
Correct.
right?
The name is known. One of my interview candidates to do the book happened to be Kathleen Chasson's son. It took me a year to convince him to talk to me because obviously there was embarrassment in the family because of what the mother had done. He lives up in New Hampshire. I managed to talk him into meeting me for lunch, and we talked. And he shared that vital information with me that, yes, his mother and Mr. Chasson had help. They had an accomplice in Norwood who supplied all those items. He says, for everybody's safety, this gentleman is still alive, and I'm not going to give you his name. So I had to go with anonymous. I didn't want to obviously dig any deeper, especially with this gentleman. He was kind enough to talk with me. I'm not very tall. I'm only about 5'6". This gentleman was at least 6'8". He arrived at the restaurant on a motorcycle. He had tattoos top to bottom and a leather jacket. So let me just say that I wasn't going to dig very deep with him or push very hard. The fact that he was willing to share information with me was huge.
Is it true that it's Ernie Bach Jr., who's the accomplice from Norwood?
Yeah, Ernie Bach Jr. has done a lot of things. I don't think he was an accomplice in an escape. His music's not bad.
Yeah, he made a nice little music career.
Yes, he did. He didn't need it too because he was selling cars. So
just for fun. Yeah. There are people there. I hope there are people in like Oregon right now listening, Googling Ernie Bach.
I would imagine. Yeah, Google the Auto Mile, and you'll find everything you need.
What was their life like while they were free after this?
It was an interesting life. I did get a lot of tidbits from the same gentleman, the son, as far as their cross-country run, places they went, things that happened to them. They lived a motel life. They did at one time have an apartment, but staying in one place made them nervous. That was in Chicago, and they felt they were being seen at times. So they decided for the rest of their 18 months on the run that they would just stay in motels for a few days and then move on to the next one. They worked. They tried to stay away from crime as best they could. Chasson worked in assorted mom and pop cafes as a cook and dishwasher. Kathleen, obviously, she had nursing training. She was a nurse's assistant, and she took jobs caring for the elderly wherever they happened to be. There was always ads in the paper for somebody to do that kind of work. So they made enough money to survive, to put food on the table, and again, just move. They took buses. They never got a car. They were taking Greyhounds from point to point. And they did get in some trouble. Kathleen actually was apprehended in a Target department store in Chicago trying to steal a television. And she was caught. And you would think that maybe the police would be involved, but the store detectives, what they would do instead is fine you and tell you never to come back to their store again. So Lee Chasson showed up and he paid $100 and off they went. He got in some fistfights along the way, his tendency to punch people. They were checking into a hotel on the outskirts of Seattle, and a couple of guys came along, and Kathleen happened to be standing in the parking lot waiting for him, and they were drunk and they were giving her a hard time, kind of jabbing at her. And Leroy came out of the motel office and beat the crap out of them, both of them. The police did show up, and the way it was described was that the police didn't like these vagrants, and they were actually somewhat pleased that Leroy dished out some punishment and let him off the hook, just told him to keep his nose clean.
They're telling this to Leroy, but he's escaped from prison. They have no idea that they're talking to a prison escapee.
Yes, exactly. A wanted murderer. He actually got in a bar fight where he stabbed the guy. It was a minor stabbing. He was arrested, brought off to jail. They did not check his fingerprints or his background. And the other guy chose not to file charges or charge him because he was a criminal himself and didn't want his name in any documents or any police investigations. And they let Leroy go.
Jeez, sometimes when you hear these stories, you're just like, wow, some people do so many bad things and they just seem to have this silver cloud or whatever, however you want to say it.
You know how I described it? Teflon. They were Teflon criminals. They did things, they got away with them. And other people suffered as a result of them as well. The America's Most Wanted episode that broadcast, there was a guy just outside of Seattle, a little town called Bremerton. He was getting married the next day, and he was out running errands for his wedding. And somebody looked at him and thought he looked like the picture he saw in America's Most Wanted. Called the police. The police surrounded this guy, guns drawn, and he just resembled Leroy Chasson. And they put him through hell the day before his wedding. He didn't have very kind things to say about the police officers in his community. But it was like a snowball downhill. Everybody was getting impacted by Leroy Chasson and Kathleen on their run across country. People got beat up, people got hurt, but they eventually made it to Denver. An added bonus to Kathleen, that's where her children were. She had 6 kids from her early marriage, and they were all in the Denver area. And so she got to see them, limited seeing them, I was told, because obviously they didn't want the police to suddenly come crashing down on the home where these children were being held, being kept with a criminal, somebody who was a fugitive. So she limited her time with her kids, visits both ways.
Now, what was that like? Like when she, I guess, appeared at that home? I mean, did she just appear randomly? Did she call first?
No,
and
that was
what
always
the
set up.
reaction?
There were meeting places and stuff. That it was explained to me. What took place was that she was married to a guy out of a town called Weymouth, Massachusetts, which oddly enough is adjacent to Quincy, where the murder took place, the original murder. She had some drug problems. She had some drinking problems. She was in rehab. Her husband divorced her and took custody of all 6 children. One of them happened to become of age. He joined the army and he was stationed in Colorado. And while he was there, he decided that he wanted his siblings with him. So they went and challenged the court, talked to the dad, all that. They didn't like their stepmother and all, there were some issues. And eventually all the kids were brought out to live with him, the oldest sibling in the Denver area. And that's where they settled. So when Kathleen arrived there at the end of her fugitive run, she was able to see her children on occasion.
Well, you said the end of the fugitive run. This is all very Bonnie and Clyde.
A Massachusetts state trooper actually used that term to describe them after the escape. They are like the Massachusetts version of Bonnie and Clyde. To a point. I mean, obviously, male-female relationship. Bonnie and Clyde robbed and killed an awful lot of people on their 2-year run. And Leroy and Kathleen didn't do that. They were just trying to stay out of handcuffs. You know how state troopers can be. They actually described the couple as that, Bonnie and Clyde.
Yeah, but it is like kind of romantic in a way because they're committing crimes in order to stay together.
Yeah, it was very romantic. Some of the things that she said that were published in assorted newspapers, no matter what he did, meaning obviously killing that kid in Quincy, she loved him and she would do anything for him. So there was something about that relationship, a little bit odd, I guess you could say, but there was quite a bit of love between them. She made huge sacrifices for his benefit.
So things didn't end up going so well for Leroy at the end of his fugitive run. Can you give us a little bit of details on that without, spoiling too much of it?
I think I can say 2 things to give you an indication without actually coming out saying it. The second broadcast of America's Most Wanted produced leads for the authorities seeking him. The FBI did find where he was living and surrounded his residence. And he had said to Kathleen and others all through the years that he was never going back to prison. They weren't going to take him back. So you can see how the scenario developed that September day, 1989, on the streets of Denver. A little bit outnumbered, I guess you could say. Oddly enough, the gun that he utilized to escape from Norwood Hospital 7 years earlier, that's the gun that was in his hand, the same one.
Do you think that he did that intentionally?
Keeping it, yes, maybe a little, I guess you could say a little sentimental value to still have that gun. But obviously trying to get another gun to replace it had he either lost it or left it behind would have been very difficult for him. Keeping that gun for that 7 years and then putting it to use. Yeah, it made some sense.
What about Kathleen? She was such an interesting character.
She actually turned herself in to the Denver police after the event. She turned herself in. She was jailed. The Massachusetts authorities sent an agent out to get her. Quick trial. Everything was admitted, and obviously it didn't take long to put her behind bars. She ended up at MCI Framingham, which, as you probably know, is the women's prison here in the Commonwealth. She didn't spend long there. They gave her the 3 years. It was 2 years for aiding and abetting a wanted fugitive, and 1 year for she broke a gun law by bringing the gun into the hospital. When she was released, paroled, she moved to Maine, found herself a place in Maine, and settled there. Oddly enough, some of her children from Colorado relocated. They came back. A couple in Maine, a couple in New Hampshire, so they were in range. and she passed away peacefully at the age of 75. One thing the family did do, they tried to change the name Chasson by adding an I, so they made it Chaisson, so it'd be harder to search. I found out the hard way.
That's clever.
Thank you so much for coming on here today and telling us about your new book. This is a very, very cool story, and we thank you for joining us here. Are you going to write another
I actually
book?
am. I've told other interviewers that my original idea back, it's about 10 years now. My original goal was to write 3 books, have a 3-book set, the whole cardboard casing with my 3 books. So yes, I am working on a 3rd book. I actually started it the day that Wild Blue Press agreed to publish Chasson's Run.
Awesome. Well, when that is all ready, you are more than welcome to come back on the show and discuss it. In the meantime, whenever the weather warms up, I'll probably see you at Dandelion's Ice Cream.
I think you will. It's one of my favorites.
Thanks so much, Dan. This was a great chatting with you.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.